Well, 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. If I had to summarize the past couple of weeks for LSU baseball, if I had to, only label a couple of words, that's what I would say. Because just when LSU gets some momentum, just when LSU starts to prove themselves, they fall right back into their bad habits, and every piece of leverage that they gained seemed to have disappeared this past weekend. What went wrong? And also, is there something going on, not just for LSU, but maybe in the SEC as a whole, that could be against LSU? We'll break all of that down and much, much more on today's edition of Locked on LSU.
You are Locked on LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked on LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's Spotify or Apple Podcasts. We're also available on YouTube as well. So make sure to subscribe to our YouTube page, Locked on LSU, so you can watch the podcast and you can also get notified as soon as the podcasts drop on YouTube. My name is Caroline Fenton, and I am a sports talk radio host in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm also an LSU alum. I'm a diehard LSU fan of all things LSU sports. You can follow me on Twitter at Caroline Fenton1. I'll post my sports takes, my LSU takes there, and you can also follow the podcast on Twitter as well. Locked on LSU is that handle where you can get podcast updates. I'll tweet out links to the YouTube page, all of that fun stuff. So make sure to follow us along on social media. But first and foremost, we got to recap that weekend of LSU baseball. We broke down a little bit of the Thursday game on Friday's episode, and the problem on Thursday was the same thing that has been riddling LSU this entire season. And I feel like a broken record when I say it, but that's because it's been an issue, and it's been a repeated issue over this entire season, and that's defense. But what was the biggest problem this past weekend when LSU got swept by Arkansas? And in the beginning of the podcast, I said 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. That's because I thought that LSU really kind of turned a corner in that series against Mississippi State, sweeping Mississippi State, statement win, 13 runs on that Sunday game. And it really looked like the defense had started to kind of repair itself a little bit. And Jay Johnson, leading up to the Arkansas series, after the Mississippi State series, said, we got to sweep, and we want to continue to have that kind of success in the future. And we were all on board for it. I was, at least. And I think that the 2 steps forward, sweeping Mississippi State, and they're now right back where they started after getting swept by Arkansas. But what went wrong there? If you just look at the numbers, it doesn't really make sense why LSU got swept in those games. And Thursday, that was absolutely a defensive issue, but Friday and Saturday, you look at Saturday, for example, Arkansas batted with a 3.33 batting average with runners in scoring position. On Saturday, on the other hand, LSU batted with a 1.43 batting average with runners in scoring position. Overall, LSU hit 297 to Arkansas's 214. That is exactly what the problem was on Saturday. Too many men on base. And that was my biggest takeaway. If you want to look at defense, that was, I think, the biggest problem on Thursday. And of course, there were plays that should have been made that weren't. And it seems like it's going to be a perpetual problem for this defense. But if you want to look at something else in that Arkansas series, too many men on base. Overall on Saturday, LSU hit better than Arkansas. But with men on base, Arkansas blew LSU out of the water. On Saturday, LSU out-hit Arkansas 11 hits to just 6 hits. But LSU left 13 runners on base, and Arkansas left 4. The offense has really never been a problem for this team. Of course, there were some games where you'd like to see the bats moving a little bit more, but this very much so is an offensive team. You looked at some of the innings that Arkansas had, 4 5-run innings over this past weekend. That sounds like something that LSU would do. We saw on Thursday, LSU was able to hit themselves out of a hole, went hitless through 5 2/3 innings, and then got 4 hits in a single inning, and they really kind of almost fought their way back to a win. And then defensive woes inhibited that, and they of course lost that game on Thursday, obviously getting swept, but leaving too many men on base. You can get the base hit, but you can't get them home. And that just bugged me all throughout this past weekend. So that was my biggest takeaway on Friday and Saturday. I think the biggest reason why LSU couldn't get those wins is they're leaving way too many men on base. Arkansas just, timed their hits right. Arkansas is a much better defensive team, but I would say LSU is a much better offensive team than Arkansas. And you can get hits all day long, but when you cannot drive those runs in, that's a problem. That is a problem, especially against a team that is so talented defensively. But where do the standings stand right now? Where is LSU amongst the SEC? So, this was on Friday night, for example, that was LSU's first shutout loss of this season. That just goes to show that while this offense has been able to carry them to plenty of wins, that's not going to be the only thing that gets them there. You need to play complementary baseball. You got to play on both sides. But right now, LSU is barely hanging on to a top 25 spot. They're at number 15. Going into the weekend, they were at number 15 on Perfect Games list, just barely hanging on by a thread on that same ranking at number 24. The D1 baseball ranking sitting at 22. USA Today baseball coaches poll ranking sitting at number 23. So in most of these rankings, if LSU's even ranked at all, there are so many different college baseball rankings, but in these three, they are just barely hanging on to a top 25 spot. But why does that matter? Because that's what the expectation of this team was. So I ran into a friend yesterday who's a huge LSU baseball fan. Shout out to Gabby. But she said, could this be just the result of, a new coach? Absolutely. We see it all the time in football that, you always got to take into account it's a first-year coach. It's going to take some time to, get this guy's guys in there with the guys that he recruits. There's going to be, a little bit of wiggle room there. There's going to be some time that it takes to get used to a coach and for a coach to implement their philosophy. So I do absolutely think that is coming into play here, that LSU has had such long tenures from the past few of their coaches. Look at Paul Maneri, who was with LSU for such a long time. We look at Skip Bertman, who was with LSU for such a long time and found so much success with LSU. So I think we're almost conditioned to just expect success because we had so many years of continued success. So I do think we do need to take it with a grain of salt. But the expectation of the team, even going into it with a new coach, was to be able to compete with some of the top teams in the country. So why does it matter if LSU is not in the top 25? I think it's because our expectations were that they would be. Now in the SEC, for example, Arkansas is ranked within the top 5 of all 5 polls. So, that kind of speaks volumes as to what they were able to do against this LSU team. But LSU in the SEC dropping down to 5 in the SEC West. Arkansas sitting in that top spot in the SEC West with Alabama, Auburn, and Texas A&M all tied at number 2 in the West. Alabama looks great against Tennessee this past weekend in their series. Mississippi State and Ole Miss sitting at the bottom of the SEC West, 6th and 7th respectively. But I think that one thing, if you look at the SEC West, you're looking at Georgia, for example, sitting at number 2 in the East. LSU still has to play Georgia. So when you look at the SEC East, and there's a really wide division between Tennessee and the rest of the SEC East. And before going into this weekend, the SEC West was much tighter. The SEC West race was much tighter, but kind of Arkansas running away, kind of playing that Tennessee West role with Arkansas, kind of running away with that top spot in the West. But LSU still has to face Georgia. And so that concerns me. Some of the best teams in the East still yet on the LSU schedule. So I haven't seen any improvements from this team, and that's a little bit concerning to me. But coming up next, is there maybe a factor for this LSU baseball team and maybe any other team in the SEC that's uncontrollable but could be contributing to some of their woes? I'll get into that coming up next. But before we do that, I want to tell you about Built Bar. Because at this point in the year, I think everyone's kind of done with their New Year's resolutions. It's not fun to go to the gym every day anymore. It's not fun to wake up at 5 a.m. anymore if that may have been your New Year's resolution. But if your New Year's resolution was to eat right, it's really easy to do that with a Built Bar because it doesn't really feel like you're eating healthy. You actually enjoy eating them. Plus, they have the puffs. If you haven't tried them, you're missing out on the Built Bars, the best tasting bars. They're a protein-infused marshmallow, the first ever of its kind, and they taste exactly like a marshmallow. They're super fluffy, they're super light, and they're a protein bar and taste like a treat because they're covered in 100% real chocolate, just like all Built bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. So it feels like you're tasting a candy bar. But they're low calorie, they're high in protein, they're much better for you than a candy bar because Built bars have only 130 calories as opposed to candy bars with 240 calories. Built bars only have 4 grams of sugar as opposed to your regular candy bar with 30 grams of sugar. Built bars have only 4 net carbs and 17 grams of protein. So if your goal is to eat right and to eat more protein, you can do that with Built Bar. And it's so easy to do on the go as well. And you don't have to sacrifice flavor because Built Bar has all kinds of flavors: white chocolate cookies and cream, coconut almond, mint brownie, all sorts of delicious flavors. And they're coming out with new kinds all the time. So you can always switch up your Built Bar rotation. At Built Bar, they're all about the taste. They make it taste delicious first, and then they figure out how to make it healthy. I don't know how they do it, but they pull it off every single time. So go to Built.com, use promo code LOCK15, and get 15% off your order. Use promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at Built.com. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Now, a very big announcement now that we're entering NFL draft time. So starting Thursday, April 28th, tune in to Locked On NFL Draft's live coverage of the 2022 NFL Draft with all 3 days of real-time analysis from our extensive lineup of experts and insiders. For those of you dying to know who your team is going to take, because I know all of you Saints fans out there are very, very anxious to figure out who the black and gold are going to draft this year, Odyssey and Locked On NFL's mock draft special by Brian Peacock and former scout Matt Williamson and Williamson NFL show all week leading up to the first pick. Now, you can find the Locked On NFL Draft live show on the Locked On NFL Draft YouTube page. Also, and that'll be on April 28th at 7 p.m. Eastern, April 29th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, and April 30th starting early at 11:30 a.m. Eastern. You can find the Odyssey NFL Mock Draft Show on Odyssey and Locked On NFL Draft podcast feeds. That will be on April 28th through April 22nd and also April 25th. So make sure to check those out if you want a little bit of information on the NFL Draft. But sometimes it's really difficult to find success whenever there are uncontrollable factors working against you. Now, umpiring and refereeing, they're going to get it wrong. It happens. It's inevitable. They're human. They're not going to call perfect games. I think, like I mentioned, while I'm talking about Saints fans, you may know that all too well, that sometimes calls just don't come in your favor. Sometimes, umping just doesn't go in your favor. But sometimes you see a perpetual issue. Now, I look at LSU, for example, and I look at that Braden Jobert call. If you weren't familiar with it, Braden Jobert facing an 0-2 count, 2 men on base, LSU up 1-0. I mean, this would have been huge to get a few runs driven in, to get some momentum going in the game. And Braden Jobert, facing an 0-2 count, steps out of the batter's box, does his normal thing, the classic baseball player superstition of undoing the gloves and tapping the foot with your bat. And right as soon as he starts to step back into the batter's box, that third base umpire waves his arms and says, "Strike 3, you're out," for taking too long out of the batter's box. I think that's the stupidest thing ever. And I'm not saying that because it was an LSU thing. I'm saying that because I think it's silly. Because baseball is a long game. And the MLB, and there's a trickle-down effect from the MLB of trying to speed up the game of baseball, trying to, improve the game a bit by speeding it up. But calling that strike, is that going to change the game from, a 4-hour game to a 3-hour, 59-minute game? I know that a little bit goes a long way, and I know that trying to limit the time of the batters taking outside of the batter's box or trying to speed pitching up a little bit, I know that that's a priority of the game right now. I just think it's so incredibly silly that was strike 3 and that was out 3, and that could have absolutely impacted the outcome of the game. And I think it's kind of a silly call to make. I think that it's kind of weak, to be honest with you. I mean, if you want to speed up the game, then, maybe, speed up. I don't know. That's not my job. It is not my job to figure out how they can speed up the game of baseball. But I just thought that it was a little bit weak from that umpire to call that a strike 3. And that absolutely did. It could have impacted the end of the game. Could the game on Saturday ended, the exact same way? Could LSU have still gotten swept? Yeah, sure. But I do think with 2 men on base, phasing an 0-2 count with 2 outs, and that's what you call strike 3, is him taking too long out of the batter's box, it doesn't really make sense to me. And this isn't an issue that's just affecting LSU. I'm not going to be a homer here and say, it's just LSU. The refs are against us. The umps are against us. I look at 2 instances this past weekend that may indicate that, is SEC umpiring kind of been an issue? Look at the Mississippi State game, for example. They were so close to securing their first SEC sweep, of the season on Saturday when they were facing Auburn. And that came up short in the final game of the series. So the game ended. This is how the out went. Pinch runner Matt Corder was ruled out. He was right at home plate. That would have been the difference in the game. Mississippi State wins. So he was just 1 inch away from home plate after the umpires reviewed the play over and over again. That would have been Mississippi State's win. And a lot of people were saying that he was safe. This, it has been a problem I've seen from so many SEC games throughout this season. And this is what Mississippi State head coach had to say after the game. This is Mississippi State head coach Chris Lemonis.
I thought he was safe, but I'm not the umpire, and I can't really comment about umpiring decisions, so I'll leave it at that.
Short and sweet. And I don't cover Mississippi State baseball. I don't know Chris Lemonis. I don't know if that's his normal diction or the way that he normally addresses some controversy. But I felt a little bit of fed upness in that answer. That I felt, I can't comment on umpiring. It is what it is. I felt a lot of frustration and a lot of fed upness there because that game against Auburn for Mississippi State and this call, the Brayton Jobert call against Arkansas, those greatly, the Mississippi State call absolutely would have impacted the end of the game. The LSU call would have impacted the end of the game. So I do have to wonder, what's going on here? These questionable calls, these controversial calls seem to happen every weekend and in several games across the league. I also look at Tennessee's series against Alabama this past weekend. Umpire threw out Tennessee's pitching coach after Alabama batter hit a line drive right to Tennessee pitcher Chase Dolander's hand. And he's, doubling over, holding his wrist, in pain, and the Alabama dugout is cheering. And that's a little suspicious to me. Don't you think you'd have a little bit of sportsmanship and you'd, maybe be silent whenever there's a hurt player out there, whenever your player hits a line drive to his wrist? Tennessee pitching coach comes out furious. Umpire throws him out. Tony Vitello, Tennessee's head coach, comes out absolutely irate, furious. Umpire throws him out. Tony Vitello chest bumps him, which is a no-no, and that's on Tony Vitello, so he'll be facing a 4-game suspension per NCAA rules. But just weird, questionable, controversial calls that kind of feel unnecessary. And I have to beg the question, is SEC umpiring an issue? Because I've seen it with LSU, and I think we've all seen it with games across the league. And it's incredibly frustrating that can affect the outcome of not just one game, of not just a couple of games, but several games across one weekend. And SEC officials, I just gotta say, do better. But switching to the LSU football side of things, we've got one LSU Tiger who entered the transfer portal and very quickly found his landing spot. We'll break down what that means for LSU in the future at that position. But before we do that, I want to tell you about Bet Online because it is your number one source for all of your betting stats and sports information. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the start of the Major League Baseball season. You can also bet on the NHL. I've used betonline.net to make a ton of my NHL bets. And now that we're getting toward the end of the season, it could be a little bit easier to make NHL bets because there are some teams that are really fighting for a playoff spot. So if they're competing against a team that, is already out of the running for the playoffs, then I usually take that team. So the team that's fighting for their spot in the playoffs because they're playing for something rather than these players, these teams who, have Cabo trips coming up. But BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. So like I mentioned, a player entering the transfer portal. Corey Kiner announced that he was entering the transfer portal, and just a few hours later said that that running back would be transferring to Cincinnati. So Kiner was a former four-star recruit. He was in the 2021 class. He was LSU's second leading rusher as a true freshman this past season. He had 324 yards and 2 touchdowns on 79 carries. So not a huge workload for Corey Kiner this past year for the purple and gold, but with Tyrion Davis-Price heading to the NFL, I thought that Corey Kiner, he was going to be kind of gifted the torch for that running back position. And he would have had a much bigger workload, of course, with Tyrion Davis-Price and some of the questions with the quarterback position with Max Johnson, some of the questions of accuracy. LSU went to Tyrion Davis-Price so many times just to run the ball, not put the ball in, in a vulnerable position in Max Johnson's hands. So I thought with Tyrion Davis-Price out and leaving, a little bit more room to throw the ball, that would have been a perfect place for Corey Kiner to step in, to take on a larger role, but not necessarily been given, not put the game on his shoulders as such a young player entering only his sophomore season. So I was really looking forward to seeing what he was going to be able to do with that additional workload. But of course, he's from Cincinnati. He's going to play for Cincinnati. He's going to be a hop and a skip from where he grew up. So I don't blame the kid at all, but it does leave LSU in kind of a tricky spot at the running back position, because of course John Emery Jr. will return from academic ineligibility as he was out this past season. LSU has another sophomore running back in Armoni Goodwin, but this does make me a little bit nervous because John Emery Jr. coming back after being out for quite some time, you can expect that there's going to be a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of acclimation period for John Emery, and especially going down in practice with a twisted ankle. It does make me concerned about the depth of the running back position. And this is going to be a different looking LSU offense. I think in the past we've been so used to this hard-nosed, this old school style of football that LSU has played with run the ball and really hard-nosed defense. So I don't think that we're going to see as much of a reliance on that running back position as we may have in the past. But the depth of the running back position absolutely is a concern of mine, especially with so many talented defensive backs and so many talented defensive lines in the SEC. You're going to have to run the ball at some point. Like, you're not going to be able to just drop back and throw these deep balls on every single play. So the running back position is important. So a little bit concerned about the depth. Absolutely come to the transfer portal to see if there's any veteran running back that can come in and kind of integrate themselves into this offense quickly. But it's going to have to happen soon because, we've heard so much about this from this LSU team that I think it was maybe Mike Denbrock. I forgot who it was exactly. That's on me. But there was an offensive coach that said they're kind of drinking these offensive plays from a fire hose right now. They've just got a lot of learning to do right now. So if they are going to try and find a solution, albeit temporary, at running back through the transfer portal, they're going to have to do that right now because, they're going to be a couple steps behind in learning this offense. But again, Corey Kiner, running back, transferring to Cincinnati. Happy for him that he can be a little bit closer to home, but that absolutely does leave this LSU running back room in a vulnerable place. But we'll continue to look at, what options are there at running back in the transfer portal. We'll get into that on tomorrow's show, as well as some spring practice updates as well. But that's going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On NFL Draft. Ryan Tracy and former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker bring the NFL Draft to life every day with insight and analysis on college football prospects and NFL front offices. It is free and available wherever you get your podcasts.